May the 4th be with you. Well, hello, welcome to week 7, APUSHers. We are getting ever closer to the 15th. Woo! Hopefully you had an opportunity today to practice with your AP tests. I know a lot of students have, and I've gotten a couple emails about that. So I'm glad you did. If not, please check out the College Board website and all the communications you've gotten from them about what you need to do to prepare for the exam, to prepare for the actual taking of the exam, not for the material on the exam. Two different things. What I want to do today in our short time together here is to talk about periods 3, 4, and 5 and talk about kind of their big ideas. So it being May the 4th, I've chosen 4 things per period to take a look at that might frame your studying and give you a great idea of what type of contextualization, what type of evidence, and what type of reasoning you should use to discuss if you had that DBQ or that period as your DBQ. So we're going to get to that in a second. Before we do that, I just wanted to give a couple reminders. We have 2 Schoology assignments this week, both of which are working on your practice DBQ from that period 6/7 mystery hybrid DBQ that I posted you've been working on. You wrote your intro paragraph, you wrote paragraph 1. Now you're going to take a look at paragraph 2, or body paragraph 2 and body paragraph 3, and you'll notice that that in each of these you're going to do the same thing, but at this time you're going to include a cap for both the second paragraph, second body paragraph, and the third, based on the document of your choosing that supports your reasoning for that particular paragraph. Tomorrow, I want to give a very specific video just about that, just about the CAP process, and I'm going to show you what I came up with for the DBQ, sample DBQ that I'm working on, which is on period 3, which will also help you study for the exam as well. So look for that tomorrow and look for those materials and assignments there on Schoology. Now let's get to the review portion. I want to take a look at period 3 first. Period 3, if we wanted to call it that, would be called the Revolutionary Period. It covers from 1754 to 1800. So this is the period in which I'm doing my sample DBQ. And the 4 main things that I want to talk about here today about period 3 specifically. The first one I want to talk about is this development of an American identity. So one of the things that we have to remember is the colonists who lived in North America, in our first 13 colonies, considered themselves British. And they were British right up until 1776, and some even later than that. And they were proud to be British. But over a period of salutary neglect, over the period of sort of distancing and a creation of an American culture all of its own, this feelings of independence, both politically and culturally, Americans start to take on this new identity. And this new identity is one that is very rooted in the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment that focuses on things like natural rights and the rights of man. And all of these will translate into an American identity that helps form a country that's entirely new. That leads into kind of our second thing, and that is this idea of the Enlightenment. Now, Enlightenment takes a couple of forms here. There's a religious Enlightenment in sort of this move away from very strict religious beliefs as people take on more of this kind of semi-Darwinian feeling of science having a role in modern life, at least a minor one to begin with. But it's more about these ideas of rights, these ideas that we're born with rights, not just British citizens, but people all over the world. Now, very conveniently, these rights don't include, in many cases, women, in all cases, African Americans, and anybody else that doesn't fit the role of a white European, a white person of European heritage. So we have to keep that in mind. Make sure you're not making absolute statements about all and everybody when you're talking about this enlightened thinking, because it only affected a certain portion of the population. The third main idea I want to talk about period 3 is this idea of revolution. And revolution comes in 3 forms, both the political, social, and economic. The political revolution is applying those enlightened ideas to politics and how we are governed as a people. So here we're talking about what will eventually kind of become our Bill of Rights, where we have specific protections that protect us from the government. This is clearly influenced by the Enlightenment. The social aspect of it ties back to that independence, but also ties back to this idea of Americans, being proud of being Americans, but also having this spirit of, if we don't like how things are going, we change it. That kind of takes root in our soul as Americans because of the revolution. And we see the examples in the continued amendments to our Constitution. We see the fact that our social beliefs in one period of time don't necessarily translate to the next, and we change the way that we live our lives, both socially, politically, and economically, to reflect this. And then lastly, economically, with the revolution, here we are cutting ties with Great Britain, and we're starting to be ourselves and be on our own, both agriculturally and industrially. We see that American industry sort of takes root first in this switch, and that agriculture takes a little while to catch up, mostly because agriculturally, most Americans grew their own food and were self-sufficient, subsistence farmers, at least to some degree. Most of our agricultural products that were making a profit were being sold to other places, mostly Europe. So this becomes another level of revolution as we form new economic ties with our former government of Great Britain, but also other European countries. Last but not least is this idea between federalism and state rights. And this sort of takes its first roots in things like the Articles of Confederation, which we see as very weak, and then are translated into the Constitution, which becomes far more federalist. And this will be the groundwork for this American struggle for the rest of basically the next 100 years. Will our government take a more national federalist role, or will we leave it to the states? Actually, this debate never goes away because we're still having it now when you consider what's going on with certain states making decisions over how they're handling the pandemic and shutdowns and things like that. So these are trends that run throughout American history. So that's sort of the four things I want you to look at when you think about period 3. Period 4, I'm going to call the constitutional era. And this is where the government really gets founded, where we see George Washington and John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and all that really enter the politics, and our government takes form in something that looks like what it looks like today, all based around the idea of the Constitution. So the first idea that we need to discuss is this idea of manifest destiny. This is something that will carry through the rest of American history, all the way through period 7 and imperialism, but manifest destiny really takes root here in period 4, as Americans are now established as Americans, and our feeling of wanting to spread out and to expand our ideas and influence now takes a kind of a governmental tack, if you will. And there's no better example of manifest destiny than the Louisiana Purchase under Thomas Jefferson. This idea of doubling the size of the United States is definitely an example of our belief in that America should spread from sea to shining sea. So that would be a great piece of outside evidence when discussing manifest destiny for period 4. The other thing we need to discuss is the Jacksonian Democracy and this idea of universal male suffrage. This ideal of America being this land of the common man is not true until Jackson becomes president and really pushes for and is encouraged by the votes of everyday Americans. Now, remember, he was not the one that passed legislation, or at least the first legislation, that allowed all white men to vote, not just landowners, but he certainly benefited from their being able to vote, and encouraged Congress and legislature and the Supreme Court to interpret the Constitution to include more white men to be able to vote. This will forever change the political system of America, because now it is open to all and will eventually lead to women and African Americans to be able to vote as well. We can't leave period 4 without talking about also about Jackson, sort of the birth of sectionalism and this divide between the North and the South. There had always been differences, but now we're seeing them really permeate into both society, politics, and the economy. We see a largely agrarian South, while the North takes on more of a mercantile and industrial kind of look, and this will be the case all the way till today, but be great contributors to the Civil War in period 5. And then the nullification crisis, led by our old and handsome Mr. Johnny C. Calhoun, who leads this nullification crisis, who puts it in the idea of people's heads that perhaps maybe the federalist system is not the best way to go, and that states have the right and the ability to nullify federal law. This will become the basis, the legal framework, and the groundwork for the Civil War, which is sort of the penultimate moment of this 19th century American history. Lastly, we need to discuss, also in the Jacksonian era, Indian affairs and the kind of final push of Americans getting rid of Native Americans and sending them west. This, again, is where Manifest Destiny and Indian affairs and moving the forced migration of Indians, Native Americans, becomes not only an idea in American, but actual government policy. Here we have things like the Trail of Tears and the Indian Removal Act. All those things would be outside evidence explaining how America, the American political system, becomes invested in these ideas that regular Americans had been kind of practicing on their own. Now it becomes governmental policy. So that's the main period, the main kind of points of period 4. Period 5 is clearly the Civil War period. All of those things we discussed in period 4 kind of move on over to period 5, but we need to kind of redefine them in this era of 1844 to 1877. 87, the first of which is this idea of sectionalism, where sectionalism starts to take root in period 4. Now it becomes a problem in period 5 as we see the society, political, and economic differences between the North and the South, and now the emergence of the West really influence the way people view what America should be. Clearly, the issue of slavery is divided along sectionalism, but the economy and the economy that slavery provides for the South and doesn't provide for the North certainly influence this divide between these two separate nations within one nation, which will eventually lead to the Civil War. We can't talk about sectionalism without talking about the causes of the Civil War, because sectionalism is one of them, obviously, this political sectionalism as well as economic and social. So I would say, if you were asked, the causes of the Civil War, I would say sectionalism being one. The second, I would talk about the divide between the Republicans and the Democrats, and how now we see sectionalism within the political process, where Republicans become the party of the North, and the Democrats, for the most part, become the party of the South. This will eventually lead to the split in the Union and the nullification of certain acts and the eventual secession of South Carolina with the other states to follow. The third cause of the Civil War, I think you would have to, talk about the economic divide between the industrial North, or the semi-industrial North, and the agricultural South, and the plantation system, as opposed to the industrial system in the North, which relied on cheap labor coming from immigrants. The South relied on cheap or nearly free labor coming from slavery, and that divide will eventually lead to the Civil War as well. Now, as outlined in many discussions that we've had, the Civil War and wars themselves aren't discussed battle by battle much on the APUSH test, especially in a DBQ. So now we need to switch our focus to what were the results of the Civil War. First and foremost, the emancipation of the slaves and the freedom which will eventually lead to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment drastically alters the political, social, and economic landscape of America in one fell swoop. That cannot be underscored enough. That changed everything. Did it change a lot in the North? Marginally. It certainly changed the relationship between the North and the South, but in the South it had drastic and significant impact. So make sure you consider that when you're writing your DBQ if you get one about period 5. The other thing we need to talk about is the Republican dominance. The Republican Party dominated the reconstruction, obviously, of post Civil War America, and the Republicans were again divided between the radical Republicans and the more moderate ones. The radical Republicans, like Thaddeus Stevens and others, were very much for the punishment of the South, where the moderate Republicans were just wanting to get them back so we can form our union again. This will lead to the crisis with Andrew Johnson, obviously, and his trial before Congress and the Senate when he was impeached, our first president to be such. And then lastly, and certainly not least, and I got to look at my notes here because I can't read my own writing. Excuse me, the weakened Southern economy. The Southern economy will not survive the drastic changes in the way that it was before, and it will be weakened for about 100 years, to the point where the North really takes the lead economically, and the South never can regain its economic strength with the loss of slavery. And that, I guess, is the price to pay for social progress. So the Southern, this new South, takes on a new role of Jim Crow laws and of segregation, as a resistance to the very dramatic change in their way of life because of the Civil War and the results of the Emancipation Proclamation and the subsequent 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So that's just kind of the results for it. The last thing I want to talk about is like, as I was mentioning, is this idea of the new South. The South will not recover from this, will be something new, and will lead into everything that will eventually become sort of a new sectionalism between the North and the South, built around racial lines and political lines, where Southern Americans do everything they can to restrict the rights of African Americans in the South, the forced migration, or not even necessarily the forced migration, but the mass migration of African Americans north to have a better life once they can, to look for industry, and the changes of urban centers. Urban centers in the South kind of plateau during this period. Urban centers in the North just balloon with the influx of immigrants and racial minorities coming up from the South into cities like Detroit, Chicago, New York, Boston, Baltimore, and the rest. So those are the four main issues of period 5. Those are the things I would look at. Those are obviously kind of hints at contextualization, but hopefully I've included a lot of outside information that you can use if you got one of those DBQs. But if you didn't understand anything that I just discussed, make sure that you take a look at any of your notes in the big APUSH packet, and if you still can't make sense of it, send me a message and I will answer your question. I guess that's all for our review for today. I know I'm going on a little long to a 20-minute video, but I hope that proved useful to you. Do your assignments, check on those, keep working on those, and I'll give you feedback as to your response later in the week. And until then, may the 4th be with you. That's right, I have 2.